In the late 1930s, Belarus existed as the western frontier of the Soviet Union, a region shaped by its geography and by its contested history. Once part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, then absorbed into the Russian Empire, its lands had shifted sovereignty multiple times. Following the First World War and the Polish-Soviet War of 1919-1921, Western Belarus was incorporated into the Second Polish Republic, while the eastern portion became the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic. This division defined the interwar decades. Families, trade networks, and cultural institutions were split between two states with contrasting political and economic systems. The Soviet-controlled East underwent collectivization and rapid industrialization in the 1930s, policies that brought both new infrastructure and severe disruptions to rural communities. Agriculture was reorganized into collective farms, and traditional village structures were transformed under state control. Political repression targeted alleged enemies of the people, including local intellectuals, clergy, and former nationalist activists. By 1939, the Belarusian SSR had grown into an important border republic of the Soviet Union, but its population bore the memory of famine, forced labor, and widespread arrests. In the West, under Polish administration, Belarusian peasants constituted a majority in many districts, but land ownership was concentrated in the hands of Polish landholders. Economic disparities and restrictions on the use of the Belarusian language in education and public life deepened discontent. The Polish government viewed the region as a zone requiring strong assimilation, while many Belarusians saw themselves caught between two competing national projects: Polish statehood on one side and Soviet communism on the other. This duality produced a fragile social fabric, prone to fractures in the event of external shocks. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 23, 1939, reshaped this landscape. Its secret protocol placed eastern Poland, including western Belarus, in the Soviet sphere of influence. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, the Red Army advanced on September 17th, occupying the region and incorporating it into the Belarusian SSR. For the first time in centuries, most Belarusian lands were administratively united under one state. However, this unification occurred through military conquest and annexation, not through independent decision-making by the population. The Soviet administration moved quickly to Sovietize the annexed territories. Land reforms redistributed estates, banks were nationalized, and political organizations not aligned with Moscow were banned. Tens of thousands of former Polish officials, officers, landowners, and intellectuals were deported eastward. The NKVD conducted arrests, and in 1941, a series of deportations affected whole families, including Belarusians perceived as politically unreliable. For many inhabitants, the Soviet presence brought material benefits such as land or employment, but also fear of surveillance and repression. By June 1941, on the eve of Operation Barbarossa, Belarus stood as a Soviet borderland with a mixed legacy. Rapid Sovietization of newly annexed territories, industrial growth in the east, and continued unrest among populations affected by repression. Militarily, the region hosted key Soviet forces of the Western Special Military District. The Red Army deployed approximately 7,000 troops in Belarusian territory, including rifle divisions, mechanized corps with tanks such as the T-34 and KV-1, and aviation units. However, many formations were undermanned, poorly coordinated, and suffering from the disorganization of recent purges in the officer corps. Across the border, the German Wehrmacht's Army Group Center assembled over 1.3 million troops for the invasion. Its order of battle included Panzer Group II under Heinz Guderian and Panzer Group III under Hermann Hoth, supported by Luftflotte and two of the Luftwaffe. German planning emphasized rapid encirclement battles, with Belarus as the principal corridor toward Moscow. Intelligence reports underestimated Soviet reserves, but identified the Western Special Military District as the likely focus of initial breakthroughs. Public sentiment in Belarus before the invasion was divided. In the East, loyalty to the Soviet Union was reinforced by years of propaganda and integration into Soviet structures, though tempered by memories of collectivization and repression. In the West, memories of Polish rule competed with Soviet promises of equality, but fear of deportations and political arrests created a climate of mistrust. No unified national project existed, and Belarus entered the war as a region fractured by competing allegiances and constrained by great power decisions beyond its control. This combination of historical legacies, Soviet policies, and German strategic planning made Belarus a central battleground from the very first days of the German-Soviet conflict. Its geography, lying between the Bug and Dnieper rivers and crossed by vital railways to Moscow, ensured that the coming invasion would devastate its territory and population, setting the stage for both large-scale military operations and the emergence of partisan warfare. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, Belarus was among the first regions to be struck. The Wehrmacht's Army Group Center advanced with two massive armored spearheads. Panzer Group III moved from East Prussia toward Vilnius and Minsk, while Panzer Group II struck from the south, crossing the Bug River and pushing toward Brest and Slutsk. Supporting infantry armies followed to consolidate control. The German plan aimed at swift encirclements and Belarusian territory, with its open plains and dense railway network, provided favorable ground for such operations. At Brest, the Soviet 6th and 42nd Rifle Divisions held the fortress complex, a 19th-century fortification with reinforced casemates. German artillery, including 600 mm Karl Great mortars, shelled the stronghold from the opening hours. Despite massive bombardment, pockets of resistance continued for days, delaying German advances and becoming one of the most symbolic early defenses of the war. Elsewhere along the front, however, Soviet formations were overwhelmed. Command confusion, poor communications, and lack of air cover exposed rifle divisions and mechanized corps to rapid encirclement by German panzer units. By the end of June, Minsk, the capital of the Belarusian SSR, had fallen. German units encircled a large portion of the Soviet Western Front in the Białystok-Minsk pocket. Approximately 29,000 Soviet soldiers were captured, alongside thousands of artillery pieces and hundreds of tanks. Luftflotte II secured air superiority, destroying Soviet aircraft on the ground and targeting retreating columns. The loss of Minsk represented not only a territorial setback, but also the collapse of Soviet defensive cohesion in the western sectors. Civilians encountered the invasion with shock and uncertainty. In towns such as Grodno, Baranovichi, and Mogilev, residents faced bombing raids that destroyed homes, railway stations, and industrial facilities. Refugees fled eastward, clogging roads already used by retreating Red Army units. Soviet authorities attempted evacuations of factories and skilled workers, moving machinery toward the Urals, but in many cases transport capacity was insufficient. Collective farms were abandoned, leaving livestock and crops vulnerable to seizure by the advancing Germans. The speed of the German advance disrupted Soviet command structures. The Western Front, commanded by General Dmitry Pavlov, suffered catastrophic losses. His inability to prevent encirclements led to his dismissal, arrest, and eventual execution in July 1941. Soviet replacements struggled to reorganize defensive lines along the Dnieper and in the forests of eastern Belarus. The Soviet leadership underestimated the tempo of German operations, expecting more time to mobilize reserves. For the German side, the opening phase confirmed their confidence in blitzkrieg methods. Encirclements yielded high numbers of prisoners, and the advance rate exceeded initial timetables. However, logistical strains already appeared: long supply lines, reliance on rail networks with different gauges, and the destruction of infrastructure by retreating Soviet forces complicated resupply. Fuel shortages and equipment wear began to slow operations, even in the first weeks. Occupation structures followed closely behind the front lines. The Wehrmacht's rear area commands, alongside Einsatzgruppen of the SS and police units, began security operations. Their objectives included eliminating potential partisan activity, seizing food supplies, and imposing German administrative control. These early measures laid the foundation for what would become an extensive system of occupation in Belarus, one that combined military exploitation with political repression. By early July 1941, German forces had secured most of Belarusian territory west of the Dnieper. Soviet units attempted to regroup near Vitebsk, Orsha, and Mogilev, where improvised defensive lines slowed the panzer thrusts. Yet the collapse of the Western Front and the loss of hundreds of thousands of troops marked the opening phase as a decisive victory for Army Group Center. Belarus, within weeks, had transitioned from a Soviet frontier republic into an occupied zone, setting the stage for both large-scale military confrontation further east and the rise of resistance movements within its forests and villages. After the rapid German breakthrough in the summer of 1941, both sides reassessed their strategic goals and adjusted their planning in relation to Belarus. For the German High Command, Army Group Center's advance across the Republic represented both an operational triumph and a logistical challenge. The Wehrmacht sought to consolidate control over the newly occupied territories while preparing for the drive towards Smolensk and ultimately Moscow. To achieve this, planners emphasized securing key railways, suppressing resistance, and exploiting Belarusian resources to sustain the campaign. The German occupation administration established multiple layers of control. Military commanders initially oversaw local governance, but by late July, civil administration began under the Reichskommissariat Ostland, headquartered in Riga. Belarus was organized into Generalbezirk Vice-Ruthenian, with its capital in Minsk. The occupation authorities prioritized agricultural output, timber, and transport facilities, essential for the German war economy. Grain requisition quotas were set, livestock was confiscated, and local factories were redirected to supply German needs. To implement these measures, German administrators often relied on auxiliary police units recruited from local populations, though loyalty and efficiency varied. The Soviet side, in retreat, adapted its strategy to the new circumstances. The Red Army's catastrophic losses during the opening weeks meant that direct counteroffensives in Belarus were impossible. Instead, the Soviet leadership concentrated on establishing defensive lines further east along the Dnieper and Smolensk. At the same time, the Communist Party and NKVD focused on laying the groundwork for partisan warfare. Even before complete German occupation, directives were issued for cadres to remain behind, organize underground networks, and sabotage German communications and supply lines. Weapons caches were hidden in the forests, and instructions were distributed to selected party activists and military personnel. From the German perspective, Belarus posed a dual challenge. On one hand, it was a corridor towards central Russia, vital for the advance on Moscow. On the other, its geography, dense forests, swamps, and poor roads created vulnerabilities for supply lines. German planners recognized the potential for partisan resistance, but initially underestimated its scope. Security divisions, police regiments, and Einsatzgruppen were assigned to rear area duties, with orders to neutralize bandit elements and ensure uninterrupted movement of troops and supplies. The Soviet propaganda apparatus framed Belarus as a front line of resistance. Radio broadcasts from Moscow and leaflets dropped by aircraft called on civilians to resist occupation, destroy transport infrastructure, and shelter Red Army stragglers. In practice, the effectiveness of these appeals depended on local conditions. Many communities were devastated by bombing and requisitions, leaving populations focused on survival. Others, particularly in forested regions, began to provide support to emerging partisan detachments. Strategically, both sides viewed Belarus not only as a battlefield, but also as a political laboratory. For the Germans, the region was part of their broader vision of Lebensraum. Nazi policy documents, including General Plan Ost, foresaw the eventual resettlement and Germanization of parts of Belarus, with large portions of its population displaced or reduced through forced labor. These long-term objectives, however, clashed with the immediate needs of sustaining the war effort, forcing the occupation authorities to rely on the very population they planned to displace. For the Soviets, Belarus became a proving ground for the partisan model of warfare. Soviet General Staff planning integrated partisan activity into the broader war effort, considering it a means to tie down German divisions, disrupt supply chains, and maintain Soviet presence in occupied territory. The NKVD oversaw the coordination of these groups, ensuring that political loyalty remained as important as military effectiveness. The emergence of partisan warfare in Belarus would, over time, grow into one of the most significant resistance movements in occupied Europe. The contrast between German strategic objectives and Soviet planning defined the situation by the end of 1941. Germany sought swift conquest and exploitation, underestimating the depth of resistance that would grow in the forests. The Soviet Union, having suffered enormous defeats, shifted to a strategy that emphasized endurance, irregular warfare, and the mobilization of civilians as an extension of the Red Army. In Belarus, these competing visions overlapped on the same territory, ensuring that the Republic would become both a battleground of conventional armies and a crucible of partisan struggle. This tension between occupation aimed at control and exploitation and resistance aimed at survival and disruption would intensify as the war progressed. By the winter of 1941-1942, Belarus was firmly under German control militarily, but the foundations for a long and destructive conflict behind the front lines had already been laid. The first confrontations between occupation forces and the growing resistance in Belarus unfolded during the second half of 1941 and into 1942. These early engagements were small in scale, but set patterns that would dominate the war in the region. Encircled Soviet troops, isolated after the rapid German advance, formed the nucleus of improvised partisan groups, while German security forces attempted to stamp out any sign of opposition through punitive measures. In the forests near Polotsk, Gomel, and Mogilev, surviving Red Army soldiers who had avoided capture joined local Communist Party activists to establish detachments. These units typically numbered between 20 and 80 fighters in the initial months. They relied on hidden weapons depots, captured German arms, or simple tools like sabotage devices placed on railway tracks. Their objectives were to disrupt communications, ambush German patrols, and maintain contact with Soviet command through clandestine radio transmissions. By the winter of 1941-1942, several hundred such groups operated across Belarus, though coordination remained limited. The German side responded with the establishment of rear security structures. Army Group Center maintained 3 security divisions, supplemented by Ordnungspolizei battalions and units of the SS. Einsatzgruppen C and B carried out systematic arrests and executions of individuals suspected of aiding the partisans. Mobile anti-partisan units were created, combining infantry, cavalry, and motorized elements. Their doctrine emphasized rapid strikes against villages believed to harbor resistance, aiming to deny the partisans food, shelter, and recruits. Railway sabotage became one of the earliest large-scale partisan tactics. German records from autumn 1941 reported dozens of train derailments, forcing the Wehrmacht to allocate additional troops to guard supply lines. Explosives placed under tracks destroyed locomotives carrying fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements toward the front. In response, the Germans organized armored trains and fortified guard posts along key railway junctions. This struggle for control of transport arteries became a defining feature of the Belarusian front. Civilian populations quickly became entangled in the conflict. Villages near partisan activity faced German reprisals, ranging from executions of suspected collaborators to the burning of entire settlements. For inhabitants, survival required navigating between two forces, partisans demanding food and information, and occupiers enforcing harsh penalties for any support to resistance. In many areas, villagers attempted neutrality, but both sides viewed such positions with suspicion. The result was widespread insecurity and shifting loyalties, with communities forced into repeated cycles of coercion. From a Soviet perspective, these early partisan actions, despite their limited size, had outsized symbolic importance. Reports transmitted to Moscow emphasized successful ambushes and acts of sabotage, framing them as proof of ongoing Soviet presence in occupied lands. By early 1942, the Soviet leadership began establishing formal partisan command centers, appointing regional commissars, and linking disparate detachments into larger formations. These efforts laid the foundation for a more structured movement capable of coordinating with the Red Army. For the Germans, the situation posed increasing challenges. Although the Wehrmacht maintained overall control, the persistence of partisan attacks in Belarus tied down divisions that might otherwise have reinforced the front line. German military correspondents noted the difficulty of securing long stretches of railway through forested terrain, where ambushes could occur at any point. Counterinsurgency operations consume manpower, fuel, and time, while generating reports of continuing unrest despite repeated sweeps. Not all armed activity in Belarus aligned with Soviet directives. Some local groups pursued their own agendas, whether nationalist or opportunistic. Small bands sometimes engaged in robbery under the guise of resistance, further complicating relations with the civilian population. The multiplicity of actors during this early stage illustrates the fragmented nature of the conflict, which only later coalesced into a more unified Soviet-led movement. By the spring of 1942, the clash between German security forces and Belarusian partisan units had hardened into a pattern. Ambushes and sabotage met by sweeps, reprisals, and escalating brutality. Although numerically small, the partisans demonstrated that German occupation was contested. The German response, aimed at intimidation and collective punishment, further alienated the population and gradually created the conditions under which larger-scale partisan warfare would expand. The first engagements thus transformed Belarus into a zone of ongoing conflict behind the front, a development that would intensify with each passing month. By mid-1942, the conflict in Belarus entered a phase of escalation. The initial period of fragmented resistance and ad hoc German countermeasures gave way to larger, more organized confrontations. Both sides recognized that the struggle in the forests, villages, and transport corridors of Belarus could determine control over the rear areas of the Eastern Front. For the German occupiers, securing Belarus was essential to maintaining the momentum of the offensive toward Moscow and later Stalingrad. Yet, as partisan activity expanded, the Wehrmacht had to divert increasing numbers of troops away from frontline operations. Security divisions were reinforced by additional Ordnungspolizei battalions, Latvian and Lithuanian auxiliary units, and formations of the Schutzmannschaft. Anti-partisan sweeps, often codenamed with designations such as Operation Bomberg in spring 1942, mobilized thousands of men to surround suspected partisan bases. These operations combined infantry, artillery, and air support, aiming to encircle and eliminate resistance. The Soviets, meanwhile, moved towards centralizing their partisan command. In May 1942, the central headquarters of the partisan movement was established in Moscow under Panteleimon Ponomarenko. Its purpose was to transform scattered detachments into a coordinated force. Radios, supply drops, and specialized instructors were dispatched across front lines, ensuring that partisan groups operated under unified Soviet direction. By the summer of 1942, partisan numbers in Belarus had grown to an estimated 3,000 fighters, organized in over 500 detachments. Coordination with the Red Army intensified, with sabotage missions increasingly timed to coincide with major offensives. The geography of Belarus shaped the escalation. The dense forests of Polesia and the marshes of the Pripyat provided cover for partisan bases, which were difficult for German patrols to penetrate. Fighters built bunkers, medical posts, and even printing presses deep within the woods. These zones became de facto liberated territories, with rudimentary governance and supply chains established under Soviet guidance. German aerial reconnaissance struggled to detect such camps, forcing reliance on ground sweeps that often suffered from ambushes and heavy attrition. For civilians, the intensification of the conflict translated into harsher conditions. German reprisals for partisan activity escalated into mass killings. Villages accused of aiding partisans were destroyed, their inhabitants executed or deported. Operations in spring and summer 1942 produced large-scale civilian casualties. German reports from Operation Bamberg alone record thousands of deaths, the majority non-combatants. At the same time, partisan requisitions of food and livestock placed further burdens on rural households already depleted by occupation policies. Families were thus caught between two sides, each demanding loyalty and resources, and punishing defiance with lethal consequences. Politically, the German authorities attempted to stabilize control through administrative structures and propaganda. The Reichskommissariat, Ostland, promoted the idea of liberation from Soviet rule, encouraging local collaboration through village councils and auxiliary police. Yet these measures clashed with the brutality of occupation, undermining potential support. For many Belarusians, survival dictated a shifting stance. Some served in the German-sponsored units, others aided partisans, and many attempted to remain neutral, though such neutrality was rarely sustainable. On the Soviet side, the partisan escalation was framed as a patriotic struggle. Radio broadcasts from Moscow highlighted sabotage successes and presented Belarus as a partisan republic resisting occupation. While intended to boost morale, this narrative also masked internal difficulties. Partisan detachments often suffered from shortages of weapons, ammunition, and medical supplies, relying heavily on airdrops or raids on German depots. Discipline varied, and disputes occasionally erupted between groups over resources and leadership. Internationally, the expansion of partisan warfare in Belarus received limited attention during 1942, overshadowed by battles at Stalingrad and in North Africa. Yet, within the German High Command, the situation was recognized as a growing threat. Reports from Army Group Center noted that partisan activity disrupted up to 10% of all supply traffic along certain lines. Each derailment or ambush forced diversions of troops, delaying reinforcements and supplies critical for operations at the front. By the end of 1942, the conflict in Belarus had shifted from sporadic engagements to sustained crisis. German anti-partisan campaigns inflicted heavy losses on civilians and fighters alike, but failed to eliminate the movement. Soviet partisans, despite hardships, grew in numbers and coordination, laying the foundation for even larger operations. The escalation entrenched Belarus as a contested rear zone, where military objectives, civilian survival, and political control collided in increasingly destructive ways. By 1943, the conflict in Belarus reached its most intense phase, as partisan activity expanded dramatically and German countermeasures grew increasingly severe. This period marked the peak of the struggle behind the front lines, with Belarus transformed into one of the most contested rear areas on the entire Eastern Front. Soviet partisan forces, benefiting from improved coordination and growing local recruitment, expanded from tens of thousands to well over 1,000 fighters by mid-1943. Their operations were no longer limited to small ambushes or isolated sabotage. Instead, large-scale actions targeted railway networks, bridges, and supply depots, striking at the logistical backbone of the German Army Group Center. The largest of these operations, often referred to as rail wars, disrupted hundreds of kilometers of track, destroyed thousands of locomotives and wagons, and forced the Wehrmacht to devote entire divisions to railway security. The German High Command responded with intensified anti-partisan operations. Security divisions, SS police regiments, and locally recruited auxiliary units conducted sweeps with code names such as Operation Khatyn in May-June 1943. These campaigns mobilized tens of thousands of troops to encircle areas suspected of harboring partisans, using artillery and airstrikes to destroy forest bases. The immediate results were devastating for civilians. Villages were burned, inhabitants executed, and survivors deported for forced labor. German reports often recorded thousands killed during such operations, though partisan losses were far lower than claimed, as many units managed to evade encirclement by dispersing into smaller groups. The scale of civilian suffering in Belarus during 1943 was extraordinary. Entire regions experienced cycles of destruction. Villages such as Khatyn, destroyed in March 1943 with its population massacred, became symbols of a broader pattern. Historians estimate that more than 600 villages across Belarus were annihilated with their residents, many of them as part of German reprisals for partisan activity. These actions aimed to deter resistance, but instead deepened hostility toward the occupiers and drove more recruits into partisan ranks. Partisan tactics evolved to meet the scale of German countermeasures. Larger brigades, often numbering several thousand fighters, were established, complete with political commissars, intelligence sections, and medical detachments. These formations could launch coordinated attacks against garrisons, convoys, and railway lines, often timing their operations to coincide with Soviet Red Army offensives at the front. The growing effectiveness of partisan warfare forced the Germans to treat Belarus not simply as an occupied territory, but as an active battlefield behind their own lines. At the same time, partisan operations imposed heavy demands on the civilian population. Requisitions of food, clothing, and shelter were constant. While many villagers supported the resistance willingly, others resented the burden, particularly when reprisals followed. This dual pressure, German exploitation on one side and partisan demands on the other, created a devastating cycle for rural communities. Families often split their allegiances for survival, with some members joining partisan brigades while others served in German organized units or attempted to remain neutral. Politically, Soviet leadership increasingly presented Belarus as a model of resistance. Reports from the central headquarters of the partisan movement celebrated the growth of the partisan republic, emphasizing the ability of irregular forces to tie down German divisions and assist Red Army operations. Propaganda broadcasts highlighted successful sabotage missions, framing them as decisive contributions to the broader war effort. Within Belarus itself, partisan detachments attempted to administer liberated areas, establishing rudimentary schools, printing presses, and local councils to maintain Soviet influence even under occupation. German authorities, meanwhile, sought to reinforce their hold through propaganda and collaboration. The Reichskommissariat Ostland promoted the image of New Europe under German leadership, while attempting to mobilize Belarusian nationalist groups against the Soviets. These efforts yielded only limited success, as the brutality of reprisals and forced labor policies overshadowed promises of autonomy. By 1943, German occupation in Belarus was increasingly defined by coercion rather than cooperation. The peak of the campaign in Belarus thus revealed both the resilience of Soviet partisan warfare and the limitations of German counterinsurgency. The territory became a zone of constant violence, where strategic railways, forests, and villages were contested in a war of endurance. For the Red Army, the partisans provided crucial support for operations such as the Battle of Kursk by tying down German reserves. For the Wehrmacht, Belarus turned into a drain on manpower and resources, complicating every attempt to stabilize the Eastern Front. By the end of 1943, Belarus stood devastated. Civilian casualties had mounted into the hundreds of thousands. Infrastructure lay in ruins, and vast swaths of the countryside existed under no stable authority. Yet, despite German efforts, the partisan movement had not been destroyed. On the contrary, it had reached its most powerful stage, preparing to play a decisive role in the coming Soviet offensives that would push the front westward and bring occupation in Belarus closer to its end. As 1944 approached, the conflict in Belarus entered a phase of adaptation and consolidation. Both the German occupation authorities and the Soviet partisan movement adjusted their strategies to the realities of prolonged warfare. For the Wehrmacht, Belarus remained a vulnerable rear area that consumed disproportionate resources. For the Soviet leadership, the territory was now fully integrated into the broader design of strategic offensives, with partisans acting as an auxiliary arm of the Red Army rather than isolated guerrilla bands. German command structures continued to prioritize security operations, but the scale of the partisan threat had forced doctrinal changes. Instead of relying solely on large sweeps, German units increasingly employed mobile hunter groups, Jagdkommandos, that used reconnaissance, dogs, and local informants to track partisan detachments. These groups sought to infiltrate forests quietly, striking before larger partisan brigades could disperse. At the same time, German authorities expanded the system of fortified villages, creating strong points along railways and highways garrisoned with police and auxiliary troops. The intent was to separate partisans from civilians, reducing their access to supplies. On the Soviet side, the central headquarters of the partisan movement standardized command structures. By early 1944, partisan formations in Belarus were organized into brigades and larger operational zones, each reporting to regional headquarters and ultimately to Moscow. These brigades sometimes numbered 2,000, 3,000 fighters, with heavier weapons including mortars, machine guns, and captured artillery. Air supply operations intensified, with Soviet long-range aviation delivering weapons, ammunition, and radio equipment. The partisans were no longer a loose collection of detachments, but a semi-regular force capable of coordinated campaigns across wide areas. Civilian populations continued to bear the weight of this dual system. German reprisals remained severe. Reports from 1943-1944 note entire villages destroyed when accused of aiding resistance. Deportations to labor camps in Germany intensified, with tens of thousands of Belarusians sent westward for forced labor in agriculture and industry. At the same time, partisan brigades requisitioned grain and livestock, sometimes imposing levies that equaled or exceeded those of the occupiers. Villagers often had little choice but to comply, with whichever side held local control at the moment, creating an environment of constant uncertainty and hardship. The political dimension of the struggle also deepened. The Soviets emphasized the idea of Belarus as a partisan republic, a phrase repeated in propaganda to symbolize national unity under Soviet leadership. Underground presses produced newspapers and leaflets distributed in occupied towns, aiming to reinforce Soviet legitimacy and counter German propaganda. In response, German authorities attempted to foster Belarusian nationalism by sponsoring cultural organizations and promising limited autonomy under German protection. These initiatives, however, failed to gain broad support, as the realities of occupation, mass killings, forced labor, and food shortages undermined credibility. By the beginning of 1944, partisan operations increasingly aligned with Red Army offensives. During the Soviet winter campaigns of 1943-1944, partisans launched attacks on railways and bridges to disrupt German troop movements. In January and February, coordinated sabotage operations destroyed hundreds of kilometers of track, delaying German reinforcements heading toward critical sectors of the front. The integration of partisan warfare into operational planning was evident. Soviet commanders timed conventional offensives with behind-the-lines disruptions, magnifying pressure on Army Group Center. German military leadership acknowledged the severity of the situation. Reports to Berlin describe Belarus as a festering wound in the rear, where partisan attacks prevented reliable movement of supplies. Security operations grew more desperate, with increasing reliance on punitive expeditions that destroyed villages indiscriminately. While these operations inflicted civilian casualties in the tens of thousands, they failed to eliminate the core partisan brigades, which remained mobile and resilient in forested terrain. The psychological toll on both occupiers and occupied was profound. For German troops, repeated deployment in anti-partisan actions eroded morale, as victories were fleeting and losses continued. For civilians, survival became a daily calculation between compliance, resistance, and flight. Families were divided. Some members joined partisan units, others served in German auxiliary formations, and many simply endured, hoping to outlast the conflict. By the spring of 1944, it was clear that the balance in Belarus had shifted irreversibly. German control extended only to fortified towns, railways, and highways, while vast stretches of countryside operated under partisan influence. The Soviet leadership prepared for a decisive blow, Operation Bagration, that would rely heavily on partisan support. In this context, the resistance in Belarus was no longer simply a matter of irregular warfare. It had become a crucial component of the Soviet war machine, setting the stage for the collapse of German power in the region. The summer of 1944 marked the decisive turning point in Belarus. Operation Bagration, launched on June 22nd, exactly 3 years after the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, represented one of the largest Soviet offensives of the war. The Red Army committed over 2.3 million troops, supported by 5,800 tanks and self-propelled guns, as well as nearly 7,000 aircraft. Opposing them, German Army Group Center fielded approximately 8,000 men, including 28 infantry divisions, 2 panzer divisions, and several security units. Despite formidable defenses on paper, the Germans were overstretched, weakened by previous losses, and unable to withstand the coordinated assault. Partisans in Belarus played a critical role in the preparatory phase of the offensive. In the weeks before the attack, Soviet command launched the so-called Second Rail War. Tens of thousands of partisans simultaneously sabotaged railway lines, bridges, and telegraph communications across the Republic. By mid-June, partisan reports claimed the destruction of more than 1,000 rails, severely disrupting German attempts to move reserves or supplies. German records confirmed extensive damage and delays, forcing reliance on limited road transport, which further strained fuel supplies. This campaign demonstrated the degree of integration between partisan warfare and Red Army operational planning. When the Soviet assault began, it struck across a wide front from Vitebsk in the north to Bobruisk in the south. Soviet forces employed deception, concentrating overwhelming strength at weak points, while misleading German intelligence into expecting a main thrust toward Ukraine. The offensive quickly shattered the German defensive lines. By late June, Vitebsk, Orsha, and Mogilev had fallen. Encirclement battles destroyed entire German corps. The Fourth Army was virtually annihilated, with more than 13,000 troops killed or captured. In the central sector, the battle for Minsk became the focal point. Partisans disrupted retreat routes, while Soviet armored spearheads advanced rapidly. By July 3rd, Minsk was encircled. Nearly 1,000 German troops were trapped in the pocket, with only small groups managing to escape westward. The fall of Minsk signaled the collapse of German Army Group Center as a coherent fighting force. In just over 2 weeks, the Soviets had advanced 400 kilometers, liberating much of Belarus. For civilians, the offensive brought both liberation and devastation. Many villages already lay in ruins from years of partisan warfare and German reprisals. Survivors emerged from forests and hiding places to find towns reduced to rubble, infrastructure destroyed, and agricultural land abandoned. Soviet authorities immediately reasserted control, re-establishing party committees, drafting men into the Red Army, and organizing emergency relief. Yet, shortages of food, medicine, and housing persisted, and disease spread quickly in the devastated regions. German survivors of the encirclements described the retreat as chaotic and disorganized. Units fragmented under constant Soviet pressure, with retreating soldiers often targeted by partisans along forest routes. Equipment was abandoned in swamps and forests as fuel ran out. The scale of the defeat shocked the German high command. Hitler replaced Field Marshal Ernst Busch with Walter Model, known as the Fireman of the Eastern Front, but even he could not prevent the collapse of German positions across Belarus. Strategically, Operation Bagration was one of the most catastrophic defeats in German military history. Estimates suggest Army Group Center lost nearly 3,000 men in killed, wounded, or captured, along with thousands of tanks, guns, and vehicles. The Soviet Union regained all of Belarusian territory, advanced into eastern Poland and the Baltic states, and opened the path toward East Prussia and Germany itself. The offensive also had international significance. It coincided with the Allied landings in Normandy, placing Germany under simultaneous pressure from east and west. For the Soviet partisans, the offensive marked the culmination of years of struggle. Many brigades emerged from the forests to join advancing Red Army units, some being incorporated directly into regular formations. Their contribution was formally acknowledged in Soviet records, with Belarus celebrated as the partisan republic. Yet the human cost remained enormous. Countless villages destroyed, millions displaced, and civilian deaths estimated in the hundreds of thousands. By the end of summer 1944, Belarus was no longer an occupied territory, but a devastated battlefield in need of reconstruction. German forces had been expelled, Soviet authority restored, and the front line moved hundreds of kilometers westward. but the scars of occupation and resistance remained visible everywhere, setting the stage for a post-war struggle of memory, rebuilding, and political control. With the liberation of Belarus in the summer of 1944, direct combat operations shifted westward, but the immediate aftermath in the Republic was defined by destruction, reprisals, and the staggering task of rebuilding. The retreat of German forces left behind a landscape transformed by years of occupation, partisan warfare, and large-scale military offensives. Entire regions lay depopulated, infrastructure was in ruins, and surviving civilians faced an environment of famine, disease, and political uncertainty. The scale of devastation was extraordinary. Pre-war Belarus had a population of about 9 million. By 1944, demographic losses were estimated at nearly 2 million dead, including soldiers, partisans, and civilians. Another 400,000 5,000 spouses had been deported to Germany as forced laborers, many of whom would not return. Over 200 towns and cities were destroyed or heavily damaged, and more than 9,000 villages had been burned during the occupation and anti-partisan operations. Infrastructure vital to daily life, railways, bridges, schools, and hospitals, was systematically dismantled or ruined. The Soviet State Commission for Investigation of Nazi Crimes documented these losses, not only as a record of destruction, but also as evidence for future war crimes trials. For civilians, liberation did not mean an immediate end to suffering. Food shortages were acute. Much of the agricultural base had been seized or destroyed, and surviving livestock was insufficient to meet needs. Epidemics of typhus and dysentery spread rapidly in areas where housing and sanitation systems had collapsed. Soviet authorities organized emergency relief, sending grain from other republics, and establishing collective kitchens. But conditions remained dire well into 1945. Politically, the return of Soviet rule was accompanied by the re-establishment of state authority and the reintegration of Belarus into the wartime mobilization system. The Communist Party reconstituted its local structures, reinstated collectivized agriculture, and began conscripting men for the Red Army, including many who had lived under occupation. NKVD units screened the population, identifying suspected collaborators, former members of German auxiliary police, and those accused of disloyalty. Thousands were arrested, deported, or tried in Soviet courts. This process reinforced the reassertion of Soviet control, but also generated new tensions within communities already fractured by years of coercion and divided loyalties. The German retreat left behind a legacy of violence in the form of scorched earth tactics and reprisals against suspected partisans and their families. In July 1944, as Wehrmacht units pulled out, they destroyed bridges, rail junctions, and industrial plants to deny their use to the Red Army. Villages along retreat routes were burned, and remaining inhabitants executed. These measures reflected both desperation and a consistent pattern of occupation policies that had relied on intimidation and destruction rather than integration. Partisans, now emerging from the forests, experienced a transition from irregular fighters to recognized veterans. Many brigades were absorbed into the Red Army, or demobilized, with members decorated for their contributions. Yet the reintegration was not seamless. NKVD screening also targeted some partisans accused of looting, indiscipline, or political unreliability. In some cases, independent-minded commanders found themselves sidelined or arrested, as Moscow sought to maintain strict central control over the narrative of resistance. Economically, Belarus faced near total collapse. Railway transport was disrupted, factories destroyed, and agriculture disorganized. Soviet planners prioritized reconstruction of transport corridors to support the continued advance into Poland and Germany, but local recovery lagged behind. Civilians often returned to villages only to find them uninhabitable, forcing temporary resettlement in nearby towns or collective shelters. The scarcity of resources required rationing and strict distribution systems, reinforcing state control over daily life. For the Germans, the collapse in Belarus was viewed as one of the worst defeats of the war. Reports from the High Command acknowledged that Army Group Center had been wiped out. The loss of hundreds of thousands of men, combined with the destruction of material resources, left the Wehrmacht unable to stabilize the Eastern Front. The defeat also accelerated the erosion of German political authority among occupied populations further west, as the rapid Soviet advance exposed the fragility of German occupation systems. Internationally, the liberation of Belarus fed into broader Allied perceptions of the shifting balance of power in 1944. Western observers noted the scale of Operation Bagration and its devastating impact on the Wehrmacht, recognizing that Soviet advances had fundamentally altered the strategic landscape in Europe. Belarus thus became both a symbol of destruction and an example of Soviet resilience, showcased in propaganda and diplomatic communications. By the end of 1944, Belarus stood at a crossroads. Liberation had been achieved, but the cost was immense. The Republic was a shattered land, its people traumatized, its economy destroyed, and its political structures tightly controlled by Moscow. The withdrawal of German forces did not end the cycle of violence. Rather, it shifted its focus toward reconstruction, retribution, and the imposition of Soviet authority. The immediate consequences of war in Belarus revealed the complexity of transition from occupation to liberation, a process that would continue to shape the region long after the fighting moved westward. The legacy of the war in Belarus was shaped as much by its extraordinary human and material losses as by the political narratives that followed. The Republic, often referred to in Soviet accounts as the partisan Republic, became emblematic of both resistance and sacrifice. Yet the long-term consequences extended beyond wartime memory, influencing post-war reconstruction, political control, and historical debate for decades to come. Demographically, the losses were catastrophic. Estimates suggest that 1 in 4 inhabitants of Belarus perished during the war, a proportion higher than in most other European regions. The Jewish population, once a significant presence in cities such as Minsk, Vitebsk, and Grodno, was almost entirely destroyed through ghetto liquidations, mass shootings, and deportations. The wartime massacres left a lasting impact on the ethnic composition of the Republic. Villages obliterated during anti-partisan operations often remained abandoned, with survivors resettled elsewhere, altering patterns of rural life. Reconstruction began almost immediately after liberation in 1944. The Soviet government launched extensive rebuilding campaigns, prioritizing railways, factories, and housing. Special commissions oversaw the restoration of Minsk, which had been reduced to ruins. Collective farms were re-established, and displaced populations were resettled into reconstructed or newly created settlements. By the early 1950s, much of the basic infrastructure had been restored, though living standards lagged and shortages persisted. The process also reinforced Soviet economic and political models. Reconstruction was presented as evidence of socialist resilience, and Belarus was integrated even more tightly into the planned economy of the USSR. Politically, the Soviet state constructed a narrative of Belarus as a land of heroic resistance. Partisan leaders were celebrated in official histories, memoirs, and monuments. Memorials such as Khatyn, inaugurated in 1969, symbolized the destruction of hundreds of villages and the collective suffering of the Belarusian people. These commemorations emphasize unity under Soviet leadership, downplaying the complexity of wartime loyalties and the existence of collaborationist units. The partisan struggle became central to Belarusian identity within the Soviet Union, reinforced through education, literature, and public ceremonies. For veterans, the legacy was mixed. Thousands of partisans received medals and recognition, but others who had operated independently of Soviet command faced suspicion. The NKVD closely monitored returning fighters, and accusations of indiscipline or insufficient loyalty led to arrests or marginalization. Similarly, civilians who had survived under German occupation without active resistance sometimes faced questions about their loyalty. These post-war tensions reflected the Soviet state's determination to control the memory of the conflict and to define resistance exclusively in terms of Communist Party leadership. Internationally, the wartime experience of Belarus remained less visible than other theaters of war, overshadowed by battles such as Stalingrad, Kursk, or Normandy. Yet, among scholars, the scale of partisan warfare and civilian losses in Belarus attracted increasing attention, especially in comparative studies of occupation and resistance in Europe. German military records highlighted the constant drain of manpower required to contain Belarusian partisans, while Soviet accounts emphasized the effectiveness of irregular warfare as a model for other struggles. The long-term cultural legacy of the war in Belarus was profound. Literature, cinema, and public discourse repeatedly returned to themes of occupation and resistance. Works such as Ales Adamovich's Khatyn story or Elim Klimov's film Come and See depicted the devastation of villages and the trauma of survivors, bringing international recognition to Belarus's wartime ordeal. These cultural representations reinforce the central place of the war in national memory. Historically, debate continues over the balance between myth and reality. While partisan warfare undeniably disrupted German operations, some historians argue that the extent of its military effectiveness has been exaggerated in Soviet accounts. Others highlight the complexity of civilian responses, noting that survival often required fluid choices rather than clear-cut resistance or collaboration. The destruction of Belarus was real and unparalleled, but its interpretation has been shaped by political needs as much as by scholarly analysis. By the late Soviet period, Belarus was firmly associated with sacrifice and resilience, a symbol of the cost of victory. After 1991, with the independence of Belarus, these narratives continued to evolve, though the memory of the partisan republic remained central to national identity. The war left an indelible mark on the landscape, demography, and historical consciousness of the republic. The significance of Belarus during the Second World War lies not only in its role as a stronghold of partisan resistance or as a battlefield of massive armies. It lies equally in the enduring consequences for its people, the destruction of communities, the shaping of collective memory, and the long-term imprint of war on every aspect of social, political, and cultural life. In this sense, Belarus stands as one of the most deeply scarred, yet symbolically powerful regions of the European wartime experience, remembered both for its extraordinary losses and for the resilience of those who endured them.